the late perks of a philosopher is that he has colleagues that can write well, and that he will get a nice obituary. So having his memory and honoring it by saying, well, connexivity is just Aristotle and Boethius, I think that's completely valid. I also think there's a adjacent project of saying, well, why are these principles attractive? And there are many different answers to that. And but one set of answers is, well, because they seem to reflect something that either people in the history of logic have thought, or that we as lay people are apt to think. And my work is just more in that second camp. And I call it connexive logic because I think of connexivity more in that sense, more as Lewis was just outlining in his remark. So that's just to situate my understanding. Of course, there are many, many interesting things about connexivity in either of those senses. One of them, I want to point out too, one of them is just the strong intuitive support. I'm really fascinated by the historical discussion, but I'm just not, I can just be a spectator to that and admire the work of Sarah and Wolfgang and others. What I can report myself is that most people I talk about and that I show these kind of principles, that they are students or friends, and explain to them what they are supposed to mean. Their reaction is most of the time, well, obviously that needs to be a law of logic if you tell them about Aristotle and so on. And I find that very striking, that this is really very strong. And so there is something, I think, that needs to be explained here. The other aspect I want to just highlight is the contraclassicality of it, of the connexive project. So I think, contrary to Wolfgang, that it's essentially contraclassical what is going on in connexive logic, and that's part of it, what makes it so interesting. Just to tell you what I think the kind of intuitions are, so I'm going through those 2 points quickly. As I said earlier in response to Andrew's talk, I'm thinking much more now about conditionals and not so much implications, because conditionals really you can ask people about, and then they will respond with very clear intuitions. And so what I think is underlining the strong reaction to Aristotle, for example, is something like, well, an intuition that it can never be right to say something like, if A is the case, then not A is the case. And that also holds true for counterfactuals, and in many kinds of conditionals have this strong reaction. If you give it to people, or if you think about it yourself, and prima facie, that's really, really convincing. So this has been mentioned as well before. I found it worthwhile to point out that in addition to Aristotle and Boethius being valid, if you are going after these kinds of intuitions, you should also ask for these unsatisfiability conditions. So the first one corresponds to Aristotle. In no model, A or not A is satisfiable. And I called these logics that have these features strongly connexive. Wolfgang asked in one of the talks, well, what's so special about that? I mean, what's isn't that obvious? And I'm not really. If you're thinking of connexivity in that second way, in that way of, hey, how can we account for these intuitions and so on, then I don't want to say that these conditions are rocket science in any sense, or very special. They strike me as kind of obvious. The interesting thing that research on connexivity has shown in the last couple of years is just that you can have one without the other. You can have Aristotle and Boethius without these conditions. So it's an interesting window on this question of how do you express things in logic, so to make sure that you get what you want, or not want. But if that is what you want, and you say, well, we do this by requiring Aristotle and Boethius to be valid, well, then there are examples where those two things fall apart. So there must be some other way of saying, no, this is actually also something I want. It's relatively ugly. I mean, it's kind of strange to talk about this kind of thing, and I try to give other characterizations that are maybe more formal or more elegant. It's kind of still the best I can offer for various reasons. As has also been mentioned, I've been very honored by Ellie and Lewis suggesting that these conditions by themselves might have interest in themselves, and calling it Kapsner strong connexivity. So it took me a while to adopt the terminology, because I was a bit shy about it, and also because I thought, well, that's actually not really what I want. But I'm warming up to the possibility that this might be, for some applications, really the more fundamental thing to achieve. Okay. The problem with strong connexivity is that it's kind of hard to achieve. We haven't seen many strongly connexive logics that have a nice semantics that goes beyond being a formal tool, but has an intuitive understanding to it. But of course, we can keep looking. I do. But let me go to the second point. Connexive logic is contraclassical. And of course, you all know that that means that connexive logic asks for more validities. So it doesn't take offense with classical logic for having too many validities, but for having too few. And that, of course, is very unusual. And so it's interesting in that respect as well. So I would say that this kind of intuitive push towards taking connexivity seriously is really unparalleled in the realm of contraclassical logics. There are very few, and none of them have the same kind of intuitive force to them. So it's really special in that sense. And then, of course, being contraclassical has formal ramifications that are interesting. And you know all that. There's one question that I haven't seen discussed in the literature, and that, of course, might be my own ignorance here, but I want to just raise it here. So if you criticize a logic and you say, well, it's not proving enough, or you say, well, it's proving too much, which of the two kinds of defects is actually worse? What is the more radical critique? And I would say on thinking through this, I would say, well, if you start thinking about it, you might say, well, proving the wrong things is kind of worse than not proving all the right things. It sort of kind of smells a bit like incompleteness, results like Gödel's, but already at the propositional level, well, but, maybe we have to get used to that as well. But proving something that is wrong intuitively, that surely seems worse. Well, the connexivist could say, no, our project is radical, more radical, because we have we know that for reasons of post-completeness, we are also asking classical logic to prove less, just by way of necessity. Yeah, you could say that, but that, it doesn't strike me as, as convincing, because these things that then you will have to give up, that doesn't seem to be part of the intuitive criticism of connexivity, that, for example, simplification needs to be given up or something. I, at this point, just want to say it's kind of hard to say. I maybe have very different ideas, and you say, well, it's very clear here. And we can talk about that. But Mark, put a pin in that question, because I want to come back to it in the talk later on. I give it a little star. So when I talk about question star, that will be the one. And I hope to give a more clear answer. I start with my way towards Aristotle's dilemma with a historical question, but it's a more recent history that I mean than going back to Abelard and Boethius and Aristotle. I'm going back to Engel. In his propositional logic with subjunctive conditionals, he asked, classical logic has frequently been charged with including too much. For example, the paradoxes of material implication. One wonders why it has not been charged with inability to include, what he means is the connexive thesis. Okay. So now, 60 years later, we can kind of update this, because now connexive logic is a much more thriving field. But my update would be, why has it taken roughly until the new millennium for the connexive attack on classical logic to become a relatively hot topic in philosophical logic? You can give a lot of answers to that strike me as plausible. I give you some candidates here. I really think that the work of Heinrich on the logic C was a watershed moment, because it's really the first time that an philosophically interesting semantics was attached to the connexive endeavor. Before that, you had these kind of many-valued matrices that have really no meaning to their values, and that, are really uninteresting. I had the chance to talk to Graham Priest recently, and he said, well, clearly it was the work of Heinrich and that interesting background story that made him talk about connexivity in the big blue book, in the introduction to non-classical logic in the second edition. Hadn't it been for that, really he wouldn't have seen the need to talk about connexivity at that point. There's also a point where I think in some ways connexivity has gotten mixed up with really unattractive ideas, at least to most people, unattractive ideas. So the failure of conjunction elimination, most people don't like that, and it's much harder to sell that than the intuitive plausibility of Aristotle's thesis, for example. Or this whole idea of negation as cancellation, as that being the defining idea behind connexive negation in some way. There are interesting points of contact here, of course, and maybe the best theory will have that failure of conjunction elimination. Maybe we have to live with that, or we will find out that it's really plausible. But in some of the writings in the past, like I'm thinking especially of Sylvan's writings, these kind of ideas are really fused together, so that sometimes he means failure of simplification by saying connexivity, and I think that has maybe had a detrimental effect. A third point here, I call it just formatting issues, and I will explain what I mean by that, because this is the point I really want to focus on, because that will bring us to Aristotle's dilemma. Okay, so again, normally we criticize classical logic as non-classical logicians by saying, well, there are some valid inferences and that are just unacceptable in classical logic. And then, as Angel in his quote said, well, one typical way of expressing that is writing down a list of paradoxes of the material conditional. With different items you find in introductory textbooks, you find different lists, but they generally look something like this. All things that if you read them with if then as the horseshoe and the other connectors in the normal way, go against initial intuitions. If we're thinking about Aristotle and Boethius and their special status in being things that classical logic omits, then it's kind of hard to just write them down in that list. So you need to start a new paragraph and write about, well, there's another way that things are hard and so on. And even worse would be the situation of someone then trying to also cram in the unsaid principles. I don't know that anyone would try to do that in an introductory textbook, but those are formatted in an even more cumbersome way. So my thought was, well, maybe that has actually something to do with the delay that we are trying to explain here, why it took so long for connexivity to become more well known. That, once you imagine you were writing your introductory textbook and you said, well, here's classical logic and here's some criticisms, and you give a list of paradoxes of the material conditional, but really you're not that into the whole non-classical thing when you say, okay, I've dealt with that and let's move on, and you don't go to the trouble of speaking about contra-classicality here. Maybe that is a little part of it. If it is, then it might be interesting to think about if we can find a paradox of the material conditional that expresses the connexive concerns. What I mean is something that is valid in classical logic, but that really goes against those intuitions I discussed earlier. So that expresses why many people find Aristotle and Boethius plausible. And in my case also, I would like to see the unsaid principles reflected. And the unsurprising answer is that I have something here that I want to suggest, and I call it Aristotle's dilemma. Here it is. A arrow not A, or not A arrow A. So that's the dilemma. That is valid in classical logic. If you think about it, it's, the first disjunct is equivalent in classic logic, equivalent to not A, the second one to A. So this is actually just a cumbersome way of expressing the law of excluded middle as far as classical logicians are concerned. But I call it Aristotle's dilemma because if you are really driven towards connexivity by thinking, Aristotle should be valid because A arrow not A really is unacceptable, and because not A arrow A is really unacceptable, well, then you have a disjunction of two things that are completely unacceptable in some way, and that is provable in logic. And I would say that deserves to be called a dilemma if you are in that situation. Really, if that question whether Aristotle would have agreed to any of this, I'm completely leaving that aside. I'm just talking about Aristotle because we're talking about Aristotle in these kind of discussions. But the historical point is to be taken with a grain of salt here. I do talk about Aristotle as a person, but someone who thinks that way will say, well, this is really a bad validity. That's the only point I'm trying to make. Okay. There should, of course, also be something corresponding to Boethius, and I have this suggestion here, just because I'm probably going to run out of time anyway. I'm focusing on Aristotle and Aristotle's dilemma because it's much easier to talk about. I think everything that I will say carries over to these kind of principles here. So back to Aristotle's dilemma. There are now these kind of connections to other topics in connexivity that I promised I would talk about. When the very first time I had this principle, Aristotle's dilemma, on a slide, Francesco Paoli was in the audience, and he said, well, you should really read up on the discussion on the chain property in the relevant literature, because what you're talking about is an instance of it. So that will be interesting. The chain property is what you see here. It's that is proof of that A arrow B or B arrow A. Okay. That principle, not under that name, so the name comes from the semantics for RM, the Kripke semantics, where the worlds form chains. That's one explanation of the name. That's relatively new. The discussion about it is pretty old. It goes back to at least the discussions about Russell's principles of mathematics. So here's a quote that was discussed in several reviews of the book. He wrote, "It follows from the above equivalence that of any two propositions, there must be one which implies the other. That false propositions imply all propositions, and true propositions are implied by all propositions." So what I put in bold here is what kind of might be formalized by Aristotle's dilemma. And it's really quite interesting to read the reviews. The most salient ones are by Sherman and McCall. And they're really focusing their critiques on this part. In fact, I think that McCall is going too far in his critique, but at least it's very clear already there that this is something that is intuitively problematic. Now, I want to fast forward that historical observation and look more at the discussion about that principle, as I said, in the relevance literature. And here, it's really the chain property comes up mostly in the discussion about our mingle. And it's kind of the bone of contention right here between those who like our mingle, arm 3, and those who don't. So Anderson and Bellner really didn't like it so much. But on the defendant side, we have Mike Dunn and Bob Meyer, and also McCall had some sympathy. And even though there was a dispute here, I've wanted to have this very sweet picture from the nice collection that Hitoshi and Heinrich edited recently on Bernard Dunn logics. So here we see that this dispute really didn't do anything to diminish the friendship between Dunn and Belknap, and of course Dunn also is unfortunately not with us anymore. But it seemed interesting to me that our mingle was something that he worked on intensively in the very beginning of his career, and also I think his last paper, or one of his last at least, is about our mingle again. So he came back to it, and we had some personal communications about Arm 3 as well. So it's a nice memory to have. But what Anderson and Belknap wrote in Entailment was on the critical side here, and it's where the chain property comes up. They write, and such theorems as A arrow B or B arrow A bring us so close to the dread material implication that in spite of the formal interest Arm has, we are inclined to echo from Alighieri 1307, lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. I apologize for the Italian here, but at least if voi are intent on entering into a theory of if-then and not some other interesting topic. Okay. So what are they referring to here? That inscription, lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, is supposed to be the sign above the gates of hell in Dante's Divine Comedy. And it translates to, if all that enter here shall abandon all hope. Here's a kind of a famous picture of the moment before Dante and Virgil enter through those gates, and you can kind of see that there is an inscription about the gates. Can't really see it clearly, but I put it in Photoshop, and then I pulled up the contrast, and actually can see that this is really the chain property that is the inscription here. So clearly they were onto something here, Anderson and Belknap. But those jokes aside, it's interesting to look at that in the sense that the chain property and Aristotle's dilemma throw an interesting light on the two kinds of problems these kind of logical projects are trying to address. So why is it that for a relevantist, A arrow B or B arrow A is problematic? Well, it's obviously because in these embedded conditionals, A and B might have no relevant connection to each other. Okay, and having no relevant connection is problematic. So, to illustrate, if you order a chair online and they send you this, that's a real bummer. That's a big problem, especially if you are a philosopher. You cannot deal with that. So imagine then you call them and you say, well, this is unacceptable, and I will send it back, and please send me a chair that has connected parts. And they say, okay, but they sent you this. That's also bad, but it's bad in a different way. And this is the second way in which things are bad is exemplified by Aristotle's dilemma. Now that is also objectionable, but not because A and not A have nothing to do with each other. Okay, that's nonsense. They have everything to do with each other. It's just that they are connected in the wrong way. They're not connected, but they're just in the wrong way in that conditional. Okay, so I thought that was a nice illustration of the fact that really we're having two different projects here, even though sometimes in the literature you get the sense that they are one and the same, or that they are closely related. I'm thinking again about the writings of Sylvan in particular, where he's talking about associative logics, and they have all these kind of properties, and they're one thing in some weird sense. But I find it interesting that even though one is an instance of the other, these two principles make clear that we're dealing with two very different projects here. And ideally, we want to succeed in getting both relevance and connexivity. But yeah, maybe that's not possible. And that will be interesting to observe. So even though it's kind of the same group of people who are interested in relevance and connexivity, sometimes it sounds like they are really the same project. They're, I think, decisively different, but related. And that relation really is an interesting one that I just want to flag here and move on to a different topic. I'm thinking that I should skip this slide. I will, just for reasons of time. I want to instead think a bit more about Aristotle's dilemma in isolation now. And I would want to draw some finer distinctions. The section is called "Finer Distinctions in Hell" because I really am enamored with the hell and fire and brimstone stone kind of imagery that you find in the work of Anderson and Bell, but especially Bob Meyer and so on. It's really a soft spot of mine. I do want to say I really don't want to offend anyone's beliefs, either religious or logical beliefs here. These things are to be taken in a lighthearted way. I hope you will. Let's go. Is maybe Aristotle's dilemma worse than the other paradoxes of the material conditional? That's an interesting question here, and I think it is. If you think about it, like the paradoxes of the material condition, or like the chain property, and if you want to think of them, that as a paradox of the material condition, Aristotle's dilemma should really not be valid. Okay. I mean, if you are driven by the kind of intuitions that I've talked about, really shouldn't be valid. But intuitively, it strikes me as pretty clear that they shouldn't even, Aristotle's dilemma shouldn't even be satisfiable. Okay. Because you really want either of those disjuncts to be satisfiable, as unset 1 tells you. So you don't want the disjunction to be satisfiable. Whereas, for example, taking again the chain property, it's really easy to think of examples that are perfectly acceptable to a relativist. Just where one of the disjoints is a relevantly connected, correct conditional, that will be satisfiable, no problem with that. But really, you can't say the same thing about A arrow not A, or not A arrow A, the concerns of the connexivist. Again, we're not really talking about contradictory instances here, but thinking about garden variety contingent statements, there's no example where this should be satisfiable. So this is actually the point where I'm harking back to that question star, which is worse, the attack of the subclassical people or the connexive attack. I think in view of that, if you are willing to broaden the idea of connexivity so far that you allow me to express the worries in the form of Aristotle's dilemma, well, then the project becomes more radical than the other subclassical logics, because you're not just pointing out that classical logic proves something that it shouldn't prove because it's not valid, but it proves something that should not even be satisfiable, which is really bad, I think. So, okay, if you think more abstractly, not just about classical logic, but logics in general, that means that there are two different ways you can criticize them by means of Aristotle's dilemma. And one of them is clearly worse than the other. Okay. And the worst case is, like classical logic does, it might validate Aristotle's dilemma. That's really as bad as it gets. So picking up on the Dante theme, that would be like the lowest circle of hell, where Satan is really even Satan, you see, is really unhappy about the validity of that formula. That's really, you don't want to be there. But there is a second way things can be bad. It might be that your logic doesn't prove Aristotle's dilemma, but it might have satisfiable instances of it. One example here is intuitionistic logic. Not very surprising, because I pointed out that in a sense there's a connection to the law of excluded middle here. But also in intuitionistic logic you have satisfiable instances. Well, that is, it's in a sense it's better, but it's not good, surely, if you are a connexive philosopher looking at these topics. So the place in Dante that we find that is pretty bad, but not as bad as deep hell, is the purgatory. Where there is really a lot of suffering, but there's a chance of salvation at some point, maybe. Okay, so thinking about the satisfiability of this formula, we'll put a logic in purgatory in these terms. Now, the kind of obvious question might be to check how these different types of connexivity that we've been discussing relate to Aristotle's dilemma. What can you actually get by focusing on Aristotle's dilemma? I make some in the paper that lies behind this talk. I'm kind of making a fuzzy requirement that if a logic has connectives that are plausible candidates for natural language and or not, and if then in a very fuzzy way, then I think we can have some correlations here in the following way. If you have connexivity, so in focusing on Aristotle, if you have Aristotle but you don't have unsaid one, and for example your logic has disjunction introduction, well then you can observe that it is at least in the purgatory, in the state where Aristotle's dilemma is satisfiable, because unsaid one says that at least one of A or not A, or the other way around, is satisfiable. What isn't settled really is if you have to go down further into Inferno or not. And an interesting test case here is the two logics we find in Cooper's propositional logic of ordinary discourse. So we have the first logic he introduces, which was later rediscovered by John Cantwell. So CN refers to Cantwell's logic, which has kind of the same matrices. And these turn out to prove Aristotle's dilemma. So that is a logic that will have to be sent to the Inferno. If you, however, read Cooper's early paper, he has another suggestion to make about conjunction and disjunction. negation and the arrow are the same. And here it's only that we find satisfiable instances of Aristotle's dilemma. And of course, what that highlights is maybe a problematic feature of Aristotle's dilemma. It's not just about negation and implication or conditional anymore. It has the additional connective of disjunction here. So you might dislike that because you want to think about connexivity in poorer languages or so on. Well, that's a problem. I haven't found any better version of a paradox of the material conditional that doesn't have an additional vocabulary like that. Now the idea of strong connexivity. If you have strong connexivity and disjunctive syllogism, then you're sure that Aristotle's dilemma can't be satisfied. But even if disjunctive syllogism isn't available, as it isn't in many beloved logics, Aristotle's dilemma is probably unsatisfiable with that fuzzy requirement of the connectives being plausible candidates for their natural language equivalents. So I have in the paper, I'm making that connection and conjecture a logic that is strongly connexive will not validate Aristotle's dilemma and not even have satisfying instances of it. Yeah, given that all of the, what I just said, it might be a bit unclear what I'm trying to say here, but ask me about it if you're curious. What it comes down to is that this has less to do with Aristotle than with the unsatisfiability. So in a sense, we can strengthen the conjecture in the following way. A logic that obeys unset one alone, maybe not Aristotle, will not validate Aristotle's dilemma and not even have satisfying instances of it. So, if you broaden the view and also think about Boethius, then this would be a Kapsner strong connexive system. Might be enough to keep you out of trouble with Aristotle's dilemma. Here's to finish up the practical application of Aristotle's dilemma that made me first think about it, was that question if there might be a pragmatic defense of non-connexive logics. I write here, I tried to supply a pragmatic defense. It's not because I really want to defend classical logic. It's not my natural inclination, but I just thought, well, it's kind of sort of obvious that this is a move that a non-connexive logician might make. That is, to take a similar approach as Grice took to the paradoxes of the material conditional, to the connexive theses, and explain why they are not valid in this case, or why unset one doesn't hold, and so on. And in the paper, there is a kind of two-part answer. It's at least for indicative conditionals, there might really be a pragmatic story that explains what needs to be explained. For example, that A or not A is always pragmatically defective, and so gives rise to these intuitions. But still, it might be true. For counterfactuals, it doesn't work. So at least there we need to grapple with connexive logic as a logic. In the paper itself, I didn't really addressed the question whether classical logic in particular can be defended in this way. And as I said, so my natural inclination would be to hope that it can't be, but that would seem to be a biased way to approach this. But still, I've been looking around a bit for potential problems. Really, Aristotle's dilemma is the only thing that really makes this dubious that this might work in the case of classical logic. In the validity of Aristotle's dilemma, we have a disjunction of two things that are, according to that pragmatic story, always unassertable. And you disjoin them, and it becomes a logical truth. And that strikes me as very strange. I should say it's quite different from Grice's story, which already has built into it this idea that most of the time tautologies will be pragmatically problematic because they don't really say anything. But that's not the problem here. It's this feature of really always being pragmatically defective, having another cousin that always is pragmatically defective, disjoin them, get a logical truth. I don't know of any other examples that have quite that same pattern. Really, that's pretty much all I can say. It's not a knockout argument against the whole approach. It's just strange, and it will need, I think, at least to be addressed, and it will need, some story that explains why this pattern isn't weird, actually, but acceptable. Yes, I think I should draw to a close. I hope that you have gotten a sense that it's interesting to think about Aristotle's dilemma, be it because it expresses the connexive worries in this special format that a paradox of the material conditional has. And it then makes comparisons to others more easy, or offers up new parallels to these. And I think I kind of like that idea that we can actually say that the connexive charge against classical logic is more severe than that of other subclassical logics, just because we're dealing here with a classical validity that shouldn't even be satisfiable according to the intuitions that we start out with. And then I went through some of the ideas which I thought were put into an interesting new light by thinking through them through the lens of Aristotle's dilemma, such as the relationship between connexive and relevance logic, ways of capturing strong connexivity and other types of connexivity by means of discussing Aristotle's dilemma. Or that last point I flashed, that it might be interesting to talk about Aristotle's dilemma in this discussion about natural language pragmatics and as an answer to the connexive intuitions. I could say a little bit more if there's time. I didn't, let me see. But I think I should stop. Should I stop?
10 minutes.
Whoa, okay. All right. So, excellent. So I have just now taking a step back. The talk is pretty much done, but just because I really like these pictures of the Divine Comedy that by the way, of Gustave Doré, and wonderful illustrations. If you remember your Dante, then you actually know that Aristotle, as a historical figure, actually comes up, and he's neither in Inferno nor is he in Purgatory. He's in Limbo. That's a picture of Limbo. Limbo is kind of a very bland and boring place in which there is no suffering, but there's also no joy. And it's where everyone gets sent that has really accrued merit in their lives, but hasn't been saved in the Christian way, because they didn't have the chance, most of them. And Aristotle is actually mentioned by name as one of the persons who walk around in limbo. And I actually don't know. This is the picture of Doré. If any of the historians in the room can tell me if one of those figures is supposed to be Aristotle, if there's some feature that we can discern that this might be Aristotle, I'd be really interested to hear about it. I couldn't find any any lists of those people. So I was wondering, kind of, okay, what is limbo in connexive terms of, in my connexive terms of. It might be this, that we do get at the end of the day these unset principles, and on top of that, the unsatisfiability of Aristotle's dilemma. So really, there's no pain to be suffered, but maybe we don't get both Aristotle and Boethius, so we don't get any joy either. What makes me think that is that we kind of, especially I've been concentrating on Aristotle, but in most cases of attractive logics that fail just a bit short of the whole package, it's Boethius that is the problem. So I'm thinking maybe we at the end of the day we might have to settle on that. Of course, the dual of limbo, lots of pain, lots of joy, would be just the real world that we live in. So that would be just Aristotle and Boethius, and not the unset principles. So maybe that is a way to say that connexive logic, in the sense of just these two principles, is the real world logic, after all. But I will leave that to further exploration. Thank you very much. I suppose I should be hearing something, but I don't. And I don't think it's the microphone. It's I think the transmission is, because I don't hear anything. In the worst case, you can write it out in the chat, but it would of course be nice to hear you. of the accounts that are connected here to the Zoom call, there's also none that is unmuted except from me. Oh yeah, now I hear something. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Andy. That I really love the references to the Divine Comedy. That was so awesome. Yeah, just a small comment on the conjecture of yours. If I understood correctly, you say that the conjecture is that in a totally connexive logic, Aristotle's dilemma must be unsatisfiable, right? And I was writing about some connexive logics which may be regarded as relevant logics as well. And in the course of writing that, I stumbled upon the chain principle being valid in all those logics.
Oh.
And one couple of interesting comments here are that Mortensen's three-valued logic, which you may know that's basically entailment with connexivity, was not Kapsner strong, but so close to being a totally connexive logic, right? And I stumbled upon...
But by totally connexive, you mean strong connexivity? Or
no, I'm thinking about Lewis and Ellie's paper, which tries to put all those criteria they list there
together.
You know?
Okay.
Yeah. And I stumbled upon Hitoshi Omori and Heinrich Bansing's 2020 paper when they remark that Mortensen's logic would be totally connexive if we understood satisfiability in a negative way. And this also saved the logic C3 from not being totally connexive. So I was thinking that maybe if we follow this argument, for instance, Mortensen's logic would be totally connexive, but it does satisfy the chain principle. It validates, the chain principle, and therefore it also validates Aristotle's dilemma. So that was my comment for the issue on the conjecture. But that's all I have to say. And otherwise, I really thank you for your talk. It was so awesome.
Well, thank you very much. I do like the idea in Heinrich and Hitoshi's paper. I have quite a lot of sympathy, but the idea. At the end of the day, I think it comes down to this question that actually I've been thinking about quite a lot. If you can see these logics as types of glutty logics, where some statements are true and false, or verified and falsified at the same time, and then the idea is, it doesn't matter that. A or not A is sometimes true, as long as we can say it's always false. That's all we need to do to satisfy our intuitions. My personal feeling is that yes, all right, until the point where you go on to say, and by the way, these kind of glutty values are designated. So that's kind of the point where I get stumbling into saying, oh wait, that's not that's not expressing then this feeling that there's something wrong with this. I mean, it might be, it's just barely true or something, but there is something wrong. Maybe that part of the intuition is captured. I think my personal intuition would be strong enough to say, hey, this needs to take a undesignated value. But I do like the idea, and I'm not completely against it, but it's cool that you point that out, that the chain property then becomes satisfiable in all of these. I haven't thought about that. I should think about it more.
Yeah, I mean, that's just also important to point out that this argument that I was telling you is dependent on presenting the semantics in a relating way, and not in terms of designated values, as you were pointing out now. But thank you, Andy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Damian, please.
Yeah. Hi, Andy. Thank you very much for the talk. I was thinking about your conjecture, and my first intuition would be that it is false, because as far as the unsatisfiability requirements go, they only concern negation and the conditional, right? And so you don't impose anything on disjunction. So there might be the case that within the logic you are working with, there are models which make true disjunctions with false disjuncts. And in fact, classical logic has these models, the non-normal models of Carnap. So, I mean, that could be a problem, not only in classical logic, but also in subsystems of classical logic, because they're going to have these non-normal models too. So that was sort of my intuition. Perhaps I'm going wrong somewhere, but I wanted to know what would you think about that. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. If you happen to know much about this discussion on the categoricity stuff in Carnap, I'd love to chat with you, because I'm really struggling with that. In particular, in trying to express these unsatisfiability requirements in different ways. You know, you could say unsat one is just A arrow, not A entails B. But exactly this categoricity kind of stuff really messes that up. I really don't know what to think about that. So maybe we can chat at some point. This pattern of the disjunction of two unsatisfiable things leading up to something satisfiable is actually a feature of a logic that I wrote about in a long time ago with Umberto Rivecchio, and we called it exactly true logic. So that is I got married in the meantime, and I have a different name now, so that might be confusing, but that was me. It's basically FDE where you only designate the top value. And that's exactly the reason why I was giving this very chewy and stumbling condition of thinking of plausible disjunctions and negations and arrows, because I personally think that the story behind the ETL disjunction is quite plausible, and so you can cook up a counterexample to this conjecture. But I only have been able to cook up a counterexample that then has a completely ridiculous conditional. So it's to my mind, there's no way to give a good conditional there. I'm really unsure about that section in the paper. I'm also very happy to send it out, the draft. If anyone has good ideas here, I'd be very thankful. But yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you.
And pushes.
Next, Luis. Here we go. Please.
Thank you. Hi, Andy.
Hi.
Some people that find the connexive principles suspicious is because they say, okay, look at the connexive principles and you are considering just very simple propositions. It works for contingent things, for example, and they say, but plug some, right? And this is strange to me because one can make the same sort of move against the intuitiveness of this Aristotle's dilemma. I think it sounds good for very simple propositions, but once you consider more complex ones, for example, the case you mentioned in intuitionistic logic might be like that. When you put some specific complex formulas, that might sound correct. I cannot think of a concrete example now, but I think that putting some contradictions or necessities in the right places, you will get perfect instances of that principle. Let me organize this. Instances of formulas that go against your intuitions to support the Aristotle's dilemma. I don't know if that makes sense. I just was thinking that it has to do with the complexity of formulas, the intuitiveness of the dilemma. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think the instances, the simplest instances that would be an example of what you're thinking about would just be B and not B for A. And so right? If you have B and not B, arrow negation of B or not B, or the other way around. If you think that that is an acceptable instance of Aristotle's dilemma, then I think that just shows that deep down you are a humble connexivist, because you think that contradictory instances of the connexive thesis are counterexamples. So that's the other side of the coin. So that in that case, it might be interesting to look at a modalized version of Aristotle's dilemma, where you just say, okay, you stick an diamond A and in front of Aristotle's dilemma, and then that is brought against classical logic, because if you enrich classical logic by modal vocabulary, still that will be something that is this aligns quite perfectly with this discussion that I bracketed between humble and not humble and so on, whatever you call not humble, and that there is a way of criticizing classical logic even if you are a humble connexivist.
Bansing, please.
Hi, Andy. If I understood you correctly, so you think that Aristotle's purgatory is unwanted also already intuitively, right?
Yeah.
So there are intuitions speaking against Aristotle's purgatory. Okay, but then I wonder how strong are these intuitions? So you pointed out that intuitionistic logic lives in Aristotle's purgatory. So would that mean that you then would also say, therefore, intuitionistic logic is dubious or unintuitive? And I think for the same reasons why intuitionistic logic lives in Aristotle's purgatory, Nelson's three-valued logic also lived there, and I thought you like it.
Yeah, I do. But if what we're, what the focus of our attention right now is the connexive intuitions, then I think, well, actually, intuitionistic logic is dubious because it has pretty much no connexive flavor to it at all. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, the dubiousness of logic is kind of pervasive. So in the other, there is no. I mean, for me, I haven't found the one true logic that I will defend until the day I die, and I don't think I will. So there will always be dubious aspects, and of course, connexive logics, as much as I like them, have very strange properties. Sometimes, some of them even the things that I otherwise champion. But given that we find something worth talking about in Aristotle, and my feeling that this has to do with A or not A, well, I will have to say that intuitionistic logic and most logics have these kind of problems. Yeah.
Sarah, please.
Hi, yeah, I have just a very brief comment on the thing that you were talking about at the end with the pragmatically unassertable conditionals that you disjoin them together, and all of a sudden you get a theorem. And it reminded me of something I came across quite recently, which is due to Haldane, a notion of a logic being unreasonable when you have two formulas that are, neither of them are theorems. They don't share any variables, yet the disjunction of them is a theorem in Lewis's system S3. So if I remember rightly, it's possibly P, or necessary Q implies necessary Q. I think those are the examples. I'm not sure. And this struck me as being kind of in the same vein, because this really, I mean, unreasonable is a good definition for a logic that has this property, because with the examples that you have, you can kind of see maybe why it might become a theorem, because they're sharing these variables, but you don't even have that here. It's like you've got these two independently, why would I ever assert these things? They aren't even theorems. And then you put them together with a disjunction and you get something provable in S3. So just an example, because you said you weren't familiar with anything. This is in the same vein.
Fantastic. Is that in the Logic of Nonsense paper?
So I came across it in John Zeman's book on the Lewis modal systems when he's talking about S3. So I don't know where Haldane introduced it. That's I just came across this like a week or two ago, and I want to track down the original reference, but haven't yet.
Very cool. Thank you very much. I will look at that up.
Is there another question? Come. Okay. Wolfgang, please.
Okay. This way, perhaps it's better without mask. I was just inspired by your talk, thinking about how might Aristotle react to your paper or to the principle which you have named Aristotle's dilemma. So let's carry out a thought experiment. We discussed with him, what do you think about this dilemma, about this formula? And his first reply, of course, would be, what do you mean by these different symbols, especially what do you mean by the arrow which you are using? So if we then answer, we understand this as a material implication, and then we explain our concept of material implication, then Aristotle will see that in this case, the dilemma formula means nothing else but A is true or A is not true. So you will say, okay, I agree to this. This is two-valued logic. Of course, I'm two-valued logician. But then again, it might be that he's asking us, but if, or he's telling us, but if we understand this arrow not as material implication, but as implication as I myself understand an implication, then of course this is false, because as is expressed in my so-called Aristotle thesis, this cannot happen. So both disjuncts are impossible in my opinion. But there's a continuation of the story, namely, if we would have a chance to discuss a little bit longer with him and introduce the notion of humble connexivity, then we could persuade him that the first disjunct proposition, which entails its own negation, is equivalent to this negation being impossible. And similarly, the second disjunct is equivalent to this proposition being necessary. So the entire disjunction, the dilemma, then says either A is impossible or it's necessary. And in this case, of course, I'm sure Aristotle would reply, so this principle is false. Not every proposition is either necessary or impossible. Okay, this is just a suggestion which you can either comment or not.
Well, yeah, and then we could check whether he is a connexivist or a humble connexivist, or maybe none at all. Like I said to Lewis, I think there are ways of using modal vocabulary that turns Aristotle's dilemma then into a critique of classical logic that excludes these cases, right? Where you say, well, let's just think of contingent instances. Well, then this shouldn't be provable. And your version of Aristotle, the one that we've worked on by explaining and convincing him, would say, okay, that case where A is contingent, that shouldn't be provable, and then it would be the humble Aristotle's dilemma. Yeah, I should actually work that out in detail and just figure out where exactly the diamonds need to go. But I'm sure it's possible. And yeah, I put that firmly on my to-do list. Thank you.
Juan Carlos, please.
Yes. I have two comments, one on logic and another on Dante. The first one is on logic. The logical truth that Sarah refers is shown in Grand Priest's introduction. Oh. And it is that if it is possible that P and not P, or Q strictly implies Q is valid in S2 and S3. So maybe Graham has some information on this logical truth, and actually he is interested that none of these disjunct share parameters, and so that's a possible way to track that logical truth. And the other, on the picture of excuse me, on the picture you show of the limbo, Dante says that Aristotle is seated among the philosophical train. So maybe he is the second person seated on the left side of the picture.
Excellent. Ah, very good. Yeah. And he has a beard, no? Very good. Thank you very much. It looked like you might have a PDF of Graham's book. Could you tell me the page number if so? Because then I could look it up right away. That would be great for me.
Inferno 4 from 131 from 132.
Excellent. Thank you, Raj.
Maybe I should know that because my English is not so good. 132. 131 a 132.
Muy bien, entendido.
The Graham Priest. It's in the problems. Problem number 7 of chapter 4.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
1 minute. Yes.
Yeah, it's very short. I have the reference that Sarah was mentioning. It's a Halden's paper on the Journal of Symbolic Logic. It's called On the Semantic Non-Completeness of Certain Lewis Calculi.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Wow, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hey.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Andy.